AP Psychology students, and welcome back. Today we are continuing with the social psychology unit, and we are moving on to the topic of attitude and attitude formations, and specifically we're going to take a look at prejudice. So this aligns with College Board topic 4.2, attitude formation and attitude change, and is learning objective 4.2a, which is explain how stereotypes and implicit attitudes contribute to the behaviors and mental processes of prejudice and discrimination. So we're going to be focusing on two essential questions today. The first is, how do our attitudes influence us? And second, how can implicit attitudes lead to bias and prejudice? So first of all, when we just think about attitudes, I really want to go over just some of the basics. So when we talk about attitude formation, of course we understand that attitudes can be positive, negative, ambivalent. Like you might not really care, you might care, kind of care, right? About all different types of ideas, concepts, or groups. When we as psychologists look at attitudes, we believe that attitudes generally consist of three parts. So you've got an emotional component of an attitude, right? A feeling. You've got a cognitive component, a thought, and you've got a behavioral component, an action. And usually those align. So if you look at the example here, affective would be emotional. So if the opinion is recycling, I feel good when I recycle. It makes me feel like positive or happy when I do something good for the earth. Cognitive component is on the bottom. It's saying recycling is good for the environment. So I believe what I'm doing. I believe that I'm making a difference. And then behavioral component is clearly just recycling, right? Like taking what you are going to throw in the trash and recycling is your behavior. Now, prejudice is a specific type of attitude toward a group of people that is negative, right? And just like all other attitudes, prejudice also contains a emotional, cognitive, and behavioral component. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so the emotion is fear, anxiety, and or hostility. And this can come from a variety of places. It could come from negative experiences. It could come from learning from your environment, so different models. It could come from what you've seen and heard in the news, lack of experience with different groups, all can lead to any of those emotions. Then there is the thought, right, the cognition. And usually prejudice is made up of some sort of stereotypical thinking. So this is the idea of when we have a generalized belief about a whole group of people. And the problem with stereotypes, or one of the largest problems, is that they can't actually be useful. So your brain thinking in stereotypes, grouping people together, allows it to reduce the cognitive load when you're making decisions. However, if you over-rely on them, right, or if you don't stop to think and really make sure that the stereotype that you're working with isn't overly broad or overly generalized or very negative, it can lead to biased perceptions of an entire group. And then the last component of the prejudice attitude would be behavior, right? And in this case, the behavior is called discrimination. So discrimination is the action of prejudice, right? And discrimination can kind of take two forms. It can be overt. So this is the kind of thing that you would see people protesting against. They are specific policies that prohibit certain groups or people from benefits that others receive. So for example, discrimination might be like not allowing people who are homosexual to marry, right? That would be an example of discrimination. And then people might protest against that. And the policy is very overt. It's stated, it's a law, or it's a rule, right? And another example of this that's not such on like a grand level might be a company like saying like, no, we are not going to serve or deal with this type of client or customer because of their sexuality or their ethnicity, etc. And then there are more subtle discrimination, and sometimes these can be referred to, or an example of this is microaggressions. So it's when you kind of say something or treat somebody different, but you're not really trying to be like discriminatory against them, but what you're saying is discriminatory or hurtful to that person. So there's two examples we have here of different things that have been said to two groups of minorities that would count as a microaggression, right? That they are being looked down upon, treated differently because of their ethnicity, background, race, culture, etc. Okay, so the next part about prejudicial attitudes that I want to go into is the difference between implicit and explicit attitudes. So explicit attitudes we're aware of, right? It's our beliefs, our ideas that we know, that we articulate, that we maybe even are proud of, or that we could tell somebody else. But we also have attitudes that are implicit, right? And these attitudes we might be unaware of or we do not always acknowledge. These are attitudes that kind of operate in our unconscious, kind of below the surface of our awareness, but they do impact us on a daily basis, even if it's in small ways that we might not totally kind of consciously recognize. So a lot of times implicit attitudes might not have a big impact, but when the implicit attitude is a bias, particularly a prejudicial bias about a certain group, that can impact our reaction to them and our actions towards them, which can make a big difference in the way that we treat people. So let's take, for example, you have one person and he has explicit bias, he's aware of it, he has implicit bias, he's unaware of it. Well, the thing about implicit bias is if he's unaware of it, then he might not even know he's doing it, right? And that might make it harder to change the behavior. So what's an example of an implicit bias, or an example that we might see in our society? So one of the things that you can notice if you look at media is that the way that white suspects and black suspects are portrayed in the media is very different. So this is a study that was done that talks about the amount of pictures or images that were used for white versus black defendants. And if you see, like, a huge majority of black defendants are pictured in mugshots and jumpsuits, and significantly more white defendants are pictured in suits. Now you're thinking, okay, well, this gives you an idea of the person, right? You're trying to set a certain image. And then why not put the black defendant in a suit, right? Or the white defendant in a jumpsuit, right? Like, why are these separate? But when you see these pictures like this over time and again and again and again, it impacts the way that you think about a particular criminal or suspect, and that may impact the way that you treat them, or if you're on a jury, what you decide about them, or if you see someone on the street, you might automatically judge them in a certain way based on these pictures that you've seen over time in the media. And these impact of implicit biases have a couple of very specific ways that they can negatively influence our world. So first is the just world hypothesis. So this is the idea people tend to believe that the world is fair, right? And that people get what they deserve and they deserve what they get. So people who, like, ultimately as little kids, we're taught that good behavior is rewarded and bad behavior is punished. So then as you get older, in order for you to make sense of the world and that bad things are happening around you, you have to kind of develop this belief that bad things happen to people because they deserve it, or because they're bad, or because it's their fault. You blame the victim, right? And in this cartoon, you can see, like, she's talking about what she has stolen, and it's like, how can you think to own those things without having them stolen, right? So, and this really makes us feel safe, because ultimately, if the world is total chaos and bad things can happen to good people, that makes life really scary. So when you see someone who's homeless, right, you might think, oh, you know, like, they're not working hard, or they don't care about getting a job, or they are a drug addict, or some negative thought that they deserve it, right? Because if we don't, then the idea could be that you could become homeless, right? So this kind of helps us make sense of the world, but aligns with those hidden negative feelings that we have. The next one, the next impact of implicit biases has to do with groups. So evolution has programmed us to live in groups for survival. Groups make us stronger, they help us, they give us community and a sense of belonging, and they are essential for like humankind, right? However, because we are so connected to the idea of groups, we tend to have some biases that go along with these groupings. So the first one is in-group bias. This is just the tendency to favor a group you're in. So when you're a junior in high school, you favor the juniors, and when you're a senior, you favor the seniors, right? So any group that you're a part of, you favor. And this can sometimes lead to ethnocentrism, where it's the idea that your culture is superior to all other cultures, because the culture you're in, you're biased towards, right? And so the culture that you're not in, then you have negative feelings because you're evaluating that culture based on your own beliefs and ideas, instead of evaluating that culture based on its own ideas. The next way that these implicit biases can impact us is something called the out-group homogeneity bias. And this is the belief that while people in your in-group are all different, right? So like, you understand that if you're a junior, that there's a lot of differences between the juniors in the junior class. However, when you think about the seniors, you think about them as all the same. So your group is different, but the out group is very similar, right? And this kind of comes across as sometimes that language is like all white girls, or all Latinos, or all men or all whatever, right? And ultimately, any group is not the same, right? There's so many differences between people no matter what the group, right? But we tend to group the out-group as all the same. So that's all we have for attitude formation and prejudice. Remember, today we talked about what develops prejudice and the implicit versus explicit attitudes and some different ways that those implicit attitudes can impact us. Make sure you can answer these essential questions. That's all for now, AP Psychos. And remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.